Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me for this workshop. I'd like to talk about police legitimacy, police leadership, specifically chief police officers, and the governance of police. And I'm going to try and make some links between this. During this short presentation, I want to talk about why I did the research, the methodology and methods used I'm going to touch on, and some of the key findings that came out of it. But I'm going to focus on the implications for governance, the way police are given political direction and oversight for police leadership and for legitimacy, and make some recommendations, hopefully as a starter for a point of discussion. Get some feedback from you and learn from you. Before I start, just like to thank the Economic and Social Research Council for funding my work at Leeds, and funding that was directly linked to the N8 PRP. And thanks to Adam Crawford and Stuart Lister at Leeds, and to Sandra Walklate and Lynn Hancock at the University of Liverpool for their patience and support working with me. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, why was I interested in the research? Well, to get some sort of declarations out of the way, I used to be a police officer. So I did 32 years as a police officer and ended up as a deputy chief constable. So I was interested in police legitimacy. Later, I'm happy to talk about the implications of being a sort of distanced insider for research, but I won't do it in any depth here, but I've got other identities. I feel like I am an academic, at least of sorts now. And but I also feel like I ought to be in the Tour de France, and I'm a father and a husband as well. So there are all sorts of identities one brings to research. Can I have the next slide? Okay. So why did I look at this particular area? If I look back at, I was interested in legitimacy as a student of the government from the very distant past. But my real interest, my recent interest, is as a senior police officer in the past, I wasn't sure that I or we as a group talked enough about the right to exercise power. We did a lot of using power. I'm not sure how much we thought about it outside sort of fairly strict legalistic approaches. So I was interested. There's also a qualitative research gap around legitimacy. So there's a lot of procedural justice research, which has interesting practical implications and is quantitative and looks at it from legitimacy from the perspective of various publics and their perceptions, but there's little that looks at it from actors within who should, by influencing what other police do and how they do it, should influence legitimacy substantially. So that's where I'm coming from. There is a body of research about chief police officers already, but it can be added to, and I think it ought to be, and their relationship with power is under research. That's why I looked at it, and what police do and how they use their powers is really important. It's the thing that sets the police aside. It's the kind of powers that they do use, as one of my participants put it, but Bittner put it much more clearly in just saying what police did in terms of using coercive force. It is an integral element of policing. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay. At the time I started the research, it's rather a long time ago now, 2013, chief officer conduct was in a matter of public debate, confidence. There have been a number of scandals, police officers, very senior police officers leaving the service, not of their own volition. Public confidence was an issue in police leadership. There was new governance through the Police Social Responsibility Act, Police and Social Responsibility Act, introduction of PCCs, localism had come in. Localism may arguably be on retreat now in policing, the Home Office trying to reassert itself, but PCCs still have the powers they used to. There was a shift in priorities, possibly reflecting shifts in police practice and demand on police. I'd highlight particular the growth of a discourse around vulnerability, about protecting the most vulnerable in society, which is actually quite a recent phenomenon. And in the background was austerity. I don't think it's gone away despite the recent uplift in resourcing for recruiting. And some of these other concerns also continue. And again, as a declaration of interest, I have until about a year ago worked for the inspectorate as an associate, and I led the inspection team conducting the leading lights inspection, and that raised issues about getting the right people in the right place at the very top of policing, about parochialism in appointment and development, and about weaknesses in embedding continuous professional development. So these concerns are knocking around as context. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, this is critical realist research. So I think there's a truth out there that can be got at, but it's rather difficult to get at. And the way I chose to try and get at those understandings and truths is through qualitative, semi-structured interviews with a cross-section of chief police officers, 16 of them in the first tranche, broadly representative of chief officers in England and Wales, but chief constables are overrepresented. I've conducted 6 more interviews this year with 3 chief constables and 3 senior representatives from other national police bodies, but those interviews have looked more closely at the policing of vulnerability, operationalising that, and what does it mean. The cohort of chief officers I interviewed came from a range of policing career backgrounds, but they'd all gone through similar career patterns of socialisation, rites of passage, such as the strategic command course. So that was quite different from the way that Robert Reiner's cohort of chief constables in the late 80s had come to their positions. They're also very different in terms of who they were, in terms of background. So they were very well educated. Only one didn't have a degree. Most had been to Russell Group universities. Just over half had master's degrees as well as first degrees. Their backgrounds were predominantly middle class. They weren't the working class elite that Reiner described. There was an absence of law and order rhetoric, and the values espoused were liberal, small L liberal, as opposed to conservative, which had been small c conservative, which had previously been found. How that translates into practice, of course, is a different issue. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so what did they say? Well, their categorizations of why the police have the right to exercise power came in 3 broad baskets. The first was that police have the right to protect people, use power to protect people, particularly the most vulnerable in society. And I had not expected the strength of this emphasis on the most vulnerable. There was nothing about protecting property, and sort of general appeals to protecting people weren't really there. It was about this most vulnerable. But what that meant, who was vulnerable, why they were vulnerable, what should be done about it, was far less clear. The second category was that police have got the right to exercise power because people, the public in a reified way, consent to the exercise of power, and police have a dialogue with their publics which allows them to understand broadly how power should be exercised. It was also tied up with notions of minimal coercion, shared values with wider populations, and the rule of law. But how those conversations were conducted in a meaningful way was a bit dubious, ill-described. There was a lot of communicating with the great and the good, as some of them put it, or with a imagined law-abiding majority. How there was engagement with people over whom power is more routinely exercised, who are more policed than protected, was much less clear. The third broad category was that police got the right to use power because the law provides that right. And the law also contains checks and balances, including the political oversight of police and the political direction of police, their governance, which gives parameters for their use of power, and that's supported by a democratic mandate. But whilst they all said that in one form or another, there was a lot of resentment of the process, of the way it was done, questioning of the motivations. And the stories were a little confused. Got the clear impression that this was not something that was often discussed. But more worryingly, from my perspective, these stories might have been a bit convenient, because they did, and they were used in some cases to allow chief officers to claim a privileged position from which for them to decide or assert what policing priorities should be. But there was lots of interesting information in there. They were engaging conversations, lots of examples of legitimacy loss, lessons that could be learnt from that, and some lessons that possibly have been forgotten. Can I move on, please? Next slide. Okay, I want to turn to the actual apprehensions they had about their governance. So one was around operational independence. They described it as grey, fluid. They had a pragmatic approach to it, but they didn't see it as giving them any kind of shield, really. And that was worrying. Also, if you haven't got the money, and if somebody else is deciding your policing priorities for you, quite what operational independence means beyond the very, very confined bit about you not turning around and arresting A because you've been ordered to by a PCC becomes difficult to define. They were probably most worried, though, about the ability to hire and fire chief constables that rests with PCCs. They felt it wasn't sufficiently controlled, and they felt their career progression and their jobs were often at risk. Hence, it becomes a question mark about being very difficult to turn around and say no, or have an argument about priorities to resist partisan demands under those circumstances. So that ability to say, back off, I'm not going to do it, as one of the participants said, becomes questionable. And it wasn't just chief constables at risk. The anxieties came from deputies and ATCs as well, and were also voiced on their behalf by some chief constables, because their careers are contingent on the views of chief constable and PCC, potentially. And all chief constables aren't perfect either, by some measure or means, I'd suggest. And there is no longer the backdrop of a police authority with a group of people with responsibility for the recruiting and removal of assistant and deputy chief constables there. It lies in the hands of one person, much as the chief constable's career depends largely in the hands of one person when it comes to recruitment and removal. Chief officers also questioned the strength of the democratic mandate held by PCCs based on poor electoral turnout. They worried about inconsistent approaches by PCCs. They were apprehensive about their overtly intrusive nature, which they felt was sometimes stopping them getting on with doing their job and was intruding. So PCCs weren't just saying what should be done, they were saying often how it should be done, which is not what operational independence had in mind. And this led to a bunch of people who seemed precarious and anxious despite their apparent power. This raises the question of who effectively holds police and crime commissioners to account. The occasional judicial review is a desperate way of doing it and ineffective. Police and crime panels don't have the power and resources to do it, and were barely mentioned by the officers I interviewed. This could destabilise police leadership, a judgment that Simon Cooper at the University of Essex has come up with in a recent article in Criminal Law Review. And it was also one of the findings of RV, Police and Crime Commissioner for South Yorkshire, came up there. Can I move on, please? Next slide. Okay, but these apprehensions weren't confined to police and crime commissioners. The views about what was at the IPCC, which is now the IOPC, were not flattering. Nobody had a good word to say about them when I asked about them. This particular quote, inept, utterly inept, was a view of a number of them. So they questioned competence, but also the motivation of the IOPC. In terms of the inspectorate, less hostile, but they still worried that it was overly intrusive. They questioned the value that it added to policing, and they saw the inspectorate as acting on behalf of the Home Secretary, not really being as independent as they felt it ought to be, not necessarily acting in the public interest in the way that it's set up to do. So that relationship didn't seem great. College of Policing, I thought, might be more influential, and maybe it is now, but when I did the interviews, they weren't, as one of the participants said, they're not central to my thinking at all. It seemed peripheral. I didn't resent the college particularly, with one particularly vociferous exception, but they did think it wasn't making much difference, which might be reflected in the fact that continuous professional development didn't seem to be at all embedded, yet it's something that the college is trying to do. So Home Office seemed to have retreated from the scene rather, but there was a lack of confidence in the Home Office. It was seen as trying to exert influence, particularly through the inspectorate, but exerting influence at a distance, but in a way where they could exert power without any responsibility for it. So if anything went wrong, it was the Chief Constable's fault or the PCC's fault. It wasn't the Home Office's problem. And there was a certain nostalgia for a Home Office which they felt in the past had been easier to engage with, to get policies agreed, where it was a more collaborative venture. So this leads to a precarious bunch of people, and as one of my participants put it, it becomes a really, really dark place for some people. And these anxieties seemed genuine. Can I move on, please? Okay, so what are the implications for police legitimacy? Well, the worry is that it leaves chief officers hesitant and less able to resist demands to encroach on civil liberties. You might think of demands that have been coming around the stamping on the Black Lives Matters process, or the various approaches to the policing of the pandemic. This is not to suggest that police officers, including chief officers, are incapable of being illiberal and stamping on civil liberties too, but are they able to resist such demands readily? Are they willing to? Secondly, if there's demands to prioritise the wants of the powerful over the needs of the marginalised, or the wants of an imagined kind of law-abiding majority over those over whom power seems to be rather more routinely exercised, have they got the will to say this is an unequal approach? It's unfair and could be delegitimating. And then, if I can move on to the final one here, which is, it just stops them being, no, sorry, could you go back? So to challenge the ability to challenge policies that just may not be evidence-based, which may be ineffective or directed at the wrong thing. Again, the ability to reject pet projects which won't deliver or unlikely to, and have that robust conversation about it, is that confidence undermined? Okay, together these things may undermine police legitimacy. Move on, please. And just a couple of other issues just to put up front again before I get to the recommendations at the end of this. Came through that when I asked about how this engagement, this discussion with publics was going on, it was pretty weak, really. The impression, there wasn't much imagination, there wasn't much evidence-based work being done. There were surveys, there was, looking at tweet decks, but how you got to publics who weren't willing normally to engage, or didn't know how to engage, or didn't have power, that was dubious. So whether it is a matter of dull compliance with policing or it's genuine consent, it's pretty hard to gauge. And I think more needs to be done with that. And I appreciate that the N8PRP at University of Liverpool through Liz Turner is doing some work on that. But my suggestion is more needs to be done. And chief officers, it was quite apparent, rarely reflected on the use of power and the supposed right to use it. They were engaging people to talk to. They came up with really interesting ideas. I don't think they were just being polite, but most of them seemed to enjoy the conversation and the opportunity to have these reflections. Perhaps there should be more opportunities for it. So can I get to the next slide, please? Just throw them all up, Ollie, please. So firstly, I'll go just straight to that public engagement one. I think there needs to be more imagination used, more evidence used to work out how to engage with the various publics. Issues like deliberative democracy, proposals like that need to be looked at more carefully to find out whether people are really consenting to the use of power, what it is they want, to get that kind of alignment of values and priorities. Secondly, the HMIC FRS, or HMIC as it used to be, did have the power to inspect police authorities. They don't have the power to inspect police and crime commissioners. I think they ought to have the power to inspect police and crime commissioners. It doesn't seem to make sense to inspect a police force but not be able to inspect the people who are telling the force what their priorities are and what the purse strings will, and who control the purse strings. And it would help balance that approach around governance. Linked to that is the third recommendation, that police and crime panels should be reviewed, their role. I'm not the first person to think of this. Lister, Loveday, Bailey, they've all made that comment and looked and suggested the power should be extended, resources should be extended. And this should really be particularly, I think, in relation to the appointment and dismissal of chief officers. And I think not just of chief constables by PCCs, but maybe there's a role for them in the selection process with chief constables of assistants and deputies, and indeed directors of finance and sort of civilian equivalent, police staff equivalent chief officers. Fourthly, I think the policing protocol order is kind of deliberately written in a grey and unclear way, but it's so diffuse that it's unhelpful. And I'm not sure that we should be talking about operational independence anymore, because it brings up images of the Police Act 64 and what came out of that, and the Royal Commission in 62, and how Lord Denning talked about it in 1968. But it's not like that anymore. An accrual of legislation such as the Police and Magistrates Court Act and PRS, the Police and Social Responsibility Act, and of guidance of performance regimes imposed by the Home Office have diminished it anyway. So let's be realistic about what it is. Patton talked about operational responsibility. Maybe that's a way to go. And there needs to be a recognition that actually leadership of police forces ends up being a collaborative effort. Police and crime commissioners, chief officer teams, Home Office, they've all got some kind of role to play at various points. And just being a bit clearer about what those roles are might be helpful. Next slide, please. In the interim, and I understand some forces have gone down this route, there's no with chief constables and PCCs. I think protocols could be agreed between them where there's goodwill, so that the delineation of operational responsibility or independence is clear, and the roles of governance and how it works is clearer. And national guidelines could be developed with the APCC, the MPCC, College of Police, and potentially the Home Office to try and help that process. So that's a possible way forward. And finally, a plug for the leading lights inspection. It's recently been raised again at the National Policing Board, particularly in terms of the diversity recommendations. But part of that is reintroducing a guiding hand to develop potential chief officers and existing chief officers, to get the right people into the right place at the very top of policing, to embed continuous professional development. I think Mike Cunningham was right this morning when he says there need to be more levers to get some national influence onto these kind of processes, and to support reflective practice amongst chief officers, which isn't to say many of them aren't reflective, but there's not enough active encouragement and support to that process. And to introduce formal mentoring systems for them. There used to be a kind of informal approach with inspectors of constabulary, but that's no longer their role. And chief officers may not feel they are vulnerable, or they might not frame themselves like that. The reality is, I think some of them are, and if you don't see yourself as vulnerable, you're probably less likely to ask for help. You might find it more difficult, and you're very unlikely to ask your own in-force routes for help. So I think some kind of national system for improved support welfare for chief officers may be worth considering. And I think that's it, Ollie. Could you move on to the next slide? It's just my contact details. Okay, that's more than enough from me. Can I invite questions, comments, anything I can learn from here, and anything that you'd like to learn from me? Ollie, I'm in your hands. I can't see any of the comments.
I'm just going to stop my screen share and just keep an eye on the chat for 2 seconds. We don't have any comments through yet, but please, someone do start us off. Be brave and...
Hello, it's Louise Westmoreland. I'd like to ask a question, please.
Thank you, Louise.
Hello. Hi, Ian. It's Louise Westmoreland. Do you remember we met at Northumbria?
Yes,
Oh, ages and ages
I do,
ago.
yes, a year or so ago, yeah.
Yeah, we had a good chat then, and thanks very much for your talk. Really interesting. Some really, interesting, observations and in-depth stuff. I'm a bit of an outsider here, so I don't want to take up too much time, but I've just got two quick questions. First is, I may have missed it at the beginning because my technology wasn't working, but have you published this anywhere as yet? Is this?
I've had it accepted. In fact, about 10 minutes ago, I got the final proofs through. So hopefully it will be in Policing a Journal, Policy and Practice imminently. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Oh, I look forward to reading that. I think my second question is a bit more complicated than that. You sort of began by saying that, or the bit I saw you begin by saying was that quite a few chief officers had left service, perhaps not of their own choice. And I got the impression that you were maybe then going to lead into something about the power they could exert over their own position or something. But then you seem to move into talking about what the chiefs didn't like about the system. So there was a whole list of things they found a bit useless. Yeah. and I wondered if really what you were saying, maybe what the real sort of behind the scenes thing is, that chief officers get the power and they want to keep it. They don't want to hear perhaps what other people have got to say. So we did a study a while ago in a couple of different towns, and we asked police officers, do you enjoy the input from members of the public? Not really. Do they understand policing issues? Not really. Would you like them to give more advice on how you police the area? Not really. But so I'm just wondering, really, sort of my question getting around to it is, don't they just want to hang on to the power and they don't really find anything very useful?
I think you're certainly right that the impetus for the Police and Social Responsibility Act was clearly that kind of concern. I think, Louise, that police officers weren't controlled, that there wasn't enough democratic accountability. I suppose my argument is actually it swung somewhat the other way, that they now have much less power and that it's an unbalanced process. There is a risk I was being used as kind of cathartic outlet, but I don't think that was happening. I think they had genuine concerns, and some of them really were in a bad place. Clearly, it's quite difficult to talk about some of that because I don't want to identify the individual's concern. But yeah, I just think the pendulum swung, and it needs to swing back in some way would be my contention. But it's not just mine. Simon Cooper's talked about that in terms of the study he did in, I think it was mainly in East Anglia and the east of England, with PCCs and PCPs and police and crime commissioners. It was the finding in the PCC for South Yorkshire, as well as one of the main findings in there, that it was destabilising and it was an unbalanced relationship. So yeah, I guess there's something entirely something what you said. There will be some resentment, and in fact, one of my findings from the PhD was that they were using some of these arguments to claim a privileged position from which to say, actually, we decide what's the right thing to do, because you, the public, whatever that public is, you don't understand. You don't understand it. You're not professional. You don't get it. They're less crude than that. But there was an element of that in there. I accept that. I don't know whether that's answered it.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
All right, we've got a couple of questions in the feed loop chat, Ian, from Ashley Brown. So the first one, how would you expect HMIC to inspect PCCs? What parameters would you expect to be set for inspection?
Well, I think if you're looking at how chief police officers are implementing policies and practice, you have to look at what policies and policies are being pushed and priorities are being pushed by the PCC. I don't think you can separate that at all. But I also think in terms of the internal governance that there should be a right to go and have a good poke around to see how that relationship's being married. Is being operationalized, much as you would look at how chief officers are trying to manage the performance of their organisation, the style in which they do it. You comment if it was overbearing and intrusive. You'd comment if it seemed to be ineffective. You might make recommendations. If there's pet projects being pushed that don't match with evidence-based, you'd expect the inspectorate to be able to say something about it. And they can say things, but they've got no power to go and sort of lift the stone and see what's under it in the way that they have with the police force. So I think they need the same kind of level of powers that they do when they're dealing with a police force.
And then I guess you might have touched upon it a little bit, but what outcomes would you expect to be achieved, or would you want to see?
Well, that PCCs felt more accountable, being held to account more. I know it's a bit vague, but actually an election every 4 years doesn't strike me as a desperately effective way of doing that. I know that will be a political argument, as we are accountable, we're elected. But I think it's more complicated than that, and the electorate surely deserves some information upon which to make judgments. Whether they'd use that information or not, I don't know. I'm not pretending that everybody goes and reads inspection reports. But I think there is a definite role to be played there. They should look at the efficiency and effectiveness of police and crime commissioners, much as they look at the efficiency and effectiveness and indeed legitimacy of chief officers and police forces generally.
There's a bit of a follow-up from Ashley in the comments. Well, do you think the move to politicise policing with the introduction of PCCs has been a success for governance arrangements? Would you expect this to be strengthened in the PCC review? And then the end of the question, Ashley's been cut off, so you might want to add a bit more, but you go for that, Ian.
Yeah. Well, policing is inevitably political, isn't it? So any decision about priorities is political. So I'm not suggesting that, I'm not suggesting that political oversight and particularly political direction of policing isn't right. It clearly is right. Because these are political decisions. So I've got no issue with that. It's how it's being done and the controls on it. You haven't got a group of people like you used to have who could have a more balanced view I've no doubt there are some excellent PCCs. I'm not making judgments about individuals. But as Loveday and Bailey identified when they were looking at the relationship more between PCPs and PCCs, they identified that there were mavericks floating around who were causing some problems. I concur with that, and the chief officers I interviewed, that was their view. They were worried about very inconsistent approaches, with some results in terms of what that meant for them and potentially for policing that could undermine legitimacy. So I'm not against more democratic input and political input. It's how it's done.
Thank you. Any follow-up, Ashley? Just comment again. But thanks, Ian. Anybody else have a question? There's another question come through from Patsy. Really interesting research. I have a more methodological question. Do you have any advice on how to recruit police officers / staff for an interview study?
I had a bit of an inbuilt advantage, because certainly with the second tranche, the ones that I've just done, I wouldn't have thought many of them. In fact, I think only one of them was likely to know me well, or know me at all, really, because I've been retired from policing for so long. But with the first tranche, a lot of people, because there's only 200 odd chief police officers, and I did a lot of national work, so people knew me. So I was able to get a foot in the door, even if I didn't know them well. People were prepared to give me an interview, and I had very few people who said no. Second time round, I found I think just asked them bluntly, I found chief officers were very open to being seen. My problem wasn't chief officers. I would have liked to interview, it'd be unfair to say who, but there was another group of people I wanted to interview, wouldn't talk to me at all. Police officers like talking. I think if you ask, you'll find a way. You might need to use gatekeepers, approach chief constable and ask, but I didn't find it particularly difficult, the access issue, but I understand it has been for others.
I think Uma's just followed up from GMP to help Patsy a bit. Also depends on the nature of the study. Most forces have evidence-based networks which will consider research opportunity. Hopefully that helps, Patsy, but if you can always follow up afterwards if you want any more assistance.
Yeah, by all means email me and about what the issue is, and I'll try and put my mind to it.
Louise has asked a question through the chat. She'd like to ask whether gender of officer makes a difference, RE power.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Louise. I didn't think I had enough data to be conclusive, but I did put an appendix in on the thesis, and I'm going to try and work it into a book that I'm hoping to get out by, which has been commissioned as part of it. Yeah, gender played a role. I'm not sure it played a role in how power was used. I think it made a difference to how some of the female chief officers were treated. And there was but it wasn't actually just about gender, it was about type. So there seemed to be some real problems with people who were male or female, who were more thoughtful. I'm not phrasing this desperately well. There was a kind of...
I know what you mean.
Yeah, people who were thoughtful and reflective, who used caveats, who didn't push themselves hard. Sometimes they did get to the top, but they seemed to be getting an unusually hard time once they got there. I found it slightly distressing that some of the people I spoke to, I thought were terribly thoughtful and were coming up with really interesting stuff, were clearly getting a really tough time. They talked about silverbacks, domination of silverbacks. And I remember that from my former days. That was an expression that went round, and when they said silverbacks, you knew the chief constables they were talking about. But also some replication of that in those who oversee policing, in what they value.
I mean, one of the reasons I asked it was because when I did my PhD, I interviewed the 5 women who were, well, Pauline Clare, who was the first woman chief, but I also interviewed 5 deputies as well. And I took it out of the book that I published from my thesis in the end, because I found it, well, it was quite sensitive, some of the things they told me, but the same things you're saying, really, that they were, you know, I can remember one sort of phrase, something like, the guy who did this job before me had his gloves and baton ready on the sideboard. You know, when did he ever use it? That kind of sort of macho thing was talked about. You'll have to go and dig out if you want to have a look at that. I've got the 5 interviews are in the thesis, but not in my book. It's really old data now, but it sounds as if, depressingly and interestingly, it sounds as if not much has changed, which is quite funny. Thank you.
I think it's still there, Louise, but trouble was I didn't go looking for it, so I didn't get enough data. Maybe I should have, but I didn't.
Well, that was me as well, because I only had the 5. When it came to writing the book, it didn't seem enough, you know, to go with. Whereas with the thesis, obviously, it was a part of the thesis, and therefore it was included. But I know what you mean. I'd really quite like to do it again. I mean, I think it would be quite an interesting thing to do again, wouldn't it? You know, the women chief constables and deputies and things go around at the time. If I'd doing another PhD. Thank you.
That's great. We've got about 15 minutes before the next session, but are there any other questions for Ian? I mean, are you happy, Ian, for the slides to be shared?
Yes, by all means, yeah.
I'll pop your email. I know you've already shared your email, but I'll put your email address in the chat on the website so people can get in touch with any follow-up questions, if you're okay with that.
That's fine, yeah.
Right, if there's no more questions, then I'll end the session and let everyone go for a little bit of a break, if you're happy with that, Ian.
And thank you very much for attending in this virtual way. I'm grateful.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.